The Supreme Court chamber was heavy with silence. Hardwood benches creaked under the weight of dozens of spectators who knew they were about to witness something rare, maybe even historic. The soft shuffle of law clerks, the scratch of pens, the shuffling of thick leather binders all seemed magnified in the pregnant stillness that clung to the room. The case on the docket wasn't just any dispute. It was one destined to ignite tension from coast to coast. At the center, a controversial state law that slashed polling stations from urban districts while leaving suburban and rural ones untouched. The law was written in careful bureaucratic language formulas, cost rationales, resource allocations, but its effect was glaring. It burdened poor and minority voters.
And now, here it was, before the highest court in America. Before a panel of 9 justices whose words would echo through history books, college lectures, and campaign speeches for decades to come. Every advocate who'd ever stepped foot in this chamber understood the stakes were suffocating.
At the podium stood Representative Jasmine Crockett, the freshman congresswoman from Texas who had built a reputation for walking into hostile rooms and emerging stronger. A former trial lawyer from Dallas, her resume brimmed with courtroom scars defending marginalized clients, dismantling predatory policies, slicing through weak cases with nothing but grit and thick binders of evidence. She had risen fast in politics, but her ascent was an accident. It was preparation turned into poetry. She knew what she was walking into. This wasn't a friendly lower court where she could rely on familiarity. This was the Supreme Court, the ultimate test of substance over spectacle. And looming in front of her, slouched slightly in his grand chair, was a man whose silence was legendary but whose words, when spoken, carried an almost seismic weight, Justice Clarence Thomas.
For decades, Thomas had been known as the quiet one on the bench. But when he did speak, it was often with deceptively simple, almost blunt questions designed to pierce the nervous rhythm of counsel. Today, though, there was something different. Today, Thomas wasn't merely clarifying a legal nuance. With the nation watching, he leaned forward, cleared his throat, and decided to go on the attack.
The gallery leaned forward instinctively. Even the other justices turned their heads slightly, eyes narrowing, waiting for what was coming. Congresswoman Crockett, Thomas began, his voice low but steady, a tone that carried across the hushed chamber. You argue that this law undermines equal protection and disenfranchises minority voters. Yet the statute never mentions race. Not once. On paper, it applies evenly to all. So how do you justify calling it discriminatory? The words landed like an iron weight. Reporters scribbled furiously. Staffers reached for their phones under the benches, thumbs flying to text colleagues. Thomas just went for her. This wasn't routine questioning. This was the Supreme Court equivalent of a cross-examination. He wasn't done. In fact, Thomas continued, his expression tightening into something between skepticism and challenge. Wouldn't your position require this court to strike down any law that has a disproportionate effect, even if it was written with neutral intent? Isn't that dangerous? Wouldn't that give judges unchecked authority to second-guess legislatures whenever statistics don't align perfectly? That is not the Constitution's role. There it was, the setup, the gauntlet thrown. A challenge as old as equal protection jurisprudence itself. Was impact enough without smoking gun language of intent? It was the opening opponents had been waiting for, delivered by one of the most senior conservative justices alive. In most scenarios, advocates flounder here. They stumble through citations, sweat through hypotheticals, lose the steady rhythm they'd built. Rooms like this punish hesitation, and Justice Thomas's timing was surgical, asking the toughest possible framing at the moment when Crockett's momentum seemed strongest. All eyes turned to her. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She adjusted the microphone. She inhaled slowly. And then she did something that sent an unexpected ripple through the chamber. She smiled. Not a wide grin. Not a nervous smirk. The kind of subtle, sharp smile that weaponized calm against intimidation. The kind that says, I've been waiting for this.
Because Crockett wasn't just prepared with talking points. She was prepared with numbers, history, precedent, and the ability to lace them into narrative. Years as a defense attorney had taught her this. The quickest way to undo an opponent's attack isn't sheer volume, but sharp precision. Still, she let the silence linger. She wanted the room to feel at the gap between Thomas's question and her answer. It built suspense, tension, and the undeniable sense that something big was about to happen.
Down in the gallery, a young law student whispered to her neighbor, "She's not rattled. Look at her, she wants this." The whisper earned a quick shush from a marshal. But the sentiment was contagious. People could feel it. The setup was about to be flipped.
This was the very essence of political theater wrapped in constitutional law. A senior Supreme Court justice, leaning on decades of gravitas, trying to box in a first-term congresswoman, and instead of panic, she offered silence, a steady smile, and the poise of someone sharpening their next words into blades. For a beat too long, the chamber hung in suspense. Pens froze above paper. Breaths caught mid-chest. Reporters had their headlines half-drafted, Thomas corners Crockett.
And then Crockett lifted her chin, eyes locking with Thomas across the bench. What came next would detonate like dynamite. Her clap back, the one that would ripple through the media for weeks, explode across TikTok and Twitter, and enter the political lexicon as one of the most viral courtroom lines in recent memory, hadn't left her lips yet. But the chamber could feel it hovering on the edge of silence. It wasn't just the answer they were waiting for. It was the eruption. And Jasmine Crockett was about to make it happen. The silence was electric. Everyone in the Supreme Court chamber could feel the crackle of anticipation. Justice Clarence Thomas's question still hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown at Crockett's feet, daring her to find a way out. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She stared back, her chin tilted, lips pressed into that unshaken smile that signaled something powerful was coming. And then she launched. "Justice Thomas, with respect, the Constitution does not blindfold itself to consequences," she began, voice clear and cutting. "You say the law makes no mention of race. But intent does not need to be in the ink when it bleeds through in the results." Gasps started through the chamber. The first line had already hit hard, confident, quotable, weaponized for replay. But Crockett didn't slow. The 14th Amendment was not passed so lawmakers could play games with language. It was passed to guarantee equal protection in reality, not just in theory. Because justice, what you call neutral criteria, has functioned as the oldest trick in the book, shifting the burden onto already burdened communities. It's not neutrality, it's camouflage. Thomas leaned back, but she pressed forward. "Here's what your question ignores. 86% of these so-called neutral closures fell in Black and Latino districts. 86. Meanwhile, majority, white districts gained new locations. That is not coincidence. That is mathematical discrimination." She snapped the binder open, though, remarkably, she didn't look down at it. She had the figures memorized. Let me give you a number everyone in this chamber can understand. A 2.9-hour average commute on public transportation just to vote for residents of Houston's 5th Ward, compared to only 26 minutes for voters in River Oaks. If that's neutrality, then I suggest we redefine the word. The crowd stirred audibly. A marshal stepped forward to shush, but it was too late. The murmurs were spreading like a rising tide. Even the justices on the bench glanced at one another subtly, eyebrows raised. Thomas tightened his lips, but Crockett wasn't finished. "You asked, Justice, do we strike down every law with uneven effects? We strike down laws where the disparity is not accident but design. And we know it's design because we have the email trails. The state's consultants literally wrote, and I quote, 'If challenged, cost efficiency is our cover.' Cover for what?
For a law that silences voters based on demographics too inconvenient for those in power. Cover for discrimination wrapped in technocratic math."
A reporter in the gallery slapped his notebook shut and mouthed what others were already thinking. This is the line. This was the quote that would appear on TikTok, on cable news cheer-ins, on activist posters. Crockett leaned closer to the mic, practically carving the air with her next words. "The Constitution nullifies sophisticated tricks just as it nullifies crude ones. Neutral language does not cleanse intentional harm. Numbers don't lie. And these numbers scream intent. The chamber convulsed. Audible gasps. A suppressed cheer that rippled from the back rows before being hushed. But the damage, or rather, the triumph had been sealed. The legendary Justice Clarence Thomas, so rarely drawn into back and forths, sat silent. Silent as Crockett's final words echoed across marble walls. Silent as the gallery took in what had just happened. Silent as the weight of decades of reputation was, at least for this moment, pierced by a congresswoman in her early 40s. Silence, and then the eruption. Outside the court, the reaction detonated instantly.
Cable news producers scrambled to replay the clip. CNN's cheer blared. Crockett confronts Thomas. Numbers don't lie. MSNBC called it a generational moment, while even Fox News, reluctant to amplify her words, ran footage under the headline, "Courtroom erupts after Crockett rebuke." On Twitter, the line became a hashtag in minutes. Hashtag numbers don't lie. Memes flooded in side-by-side photos of Thomas leaning in versus his silence afterward with captions like, "When the OJ gets schooled." TikTok loops remixed her calm delivery into viral soundbites layered over beats.
Instagram Reels cut the moment in cinematic slow-mo, text overlaid. She left him speechless. Even law students seized it immediately. Group chats buzzed, professors dropped links into syllabi, and within days Crockett's clapback was discussed as the case study of advocacy under pressure.
Political insiders whispered giddily to reporters, this wasn't just a good answer. This was a star-making moment. Crockett had walked into the most intimidating chamber in America, stood against one of its most enduring justices, and walked out not rattled but elevated.
Donors noticed. Within 24 hours, her campaign reported a surge of contributions. Activist groups blasted the clip in promotional emails. One subject line simply read, "She shut down Clarence Thomas in 20 seconds." Podcasts couldn't get enough of it. On one progressive show, a host marveled, "Do you realize how hard it is to make Clarence Thomas grimace, let alone leave him silent?" Crockett didn't just answer, she detonated a whole strategy in one reply. Even conservative commentators, though dismissive of the theatrics, admitted grudgingly, she was prepared. She owned that exchange.
Inside the political ecosystem, senior Democrats pointed to Crockett as the model for their new wave. Armed with receipts, fluent in courtroom cadence, and comfortable using viral clarity to connect complex constitutional principles with plain language, even a few centrist voices compared her cool, data-driven tone to legendary oral advocates.
Weeks later, law reviews cited the clash in new articles about impact versus intent in equal protection doctrine. Activists quoted "numbers don't lie" as a rallying slogan at rallies. Meme culture made it funny, but legal scholars made it serious. Crockett's response entered both streams simultaneously. And while Justice Thomas eventually spoke again on other cases, this exchange stuck like burrs to fabric, reminders that even seniority and the robes of power can be punctured by clarity wielded at the right time. For Jasmine Crockett, it was another brick in the foundation of her growing reputation. Not a loud partisan, not just an elected firebrand, but someone who could sit across from titans of the American legal system and dismantle their questions with confidence, data, and moral clarity. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a declaration of presence. When she later spoke to reporters, her answer to how she'd stayed so composed was simple. Preparation. That's it. You respect the room. You master the material. And then you remember who you're fighting for, the voters whose voices are at stake. Once you remember that, even the Supreme Court doesn't scare you.
In time, Clarence Thomas's grin returned in other arguments. But that day, in that moment, on that issue it vanished, wiped away by a single congresswoman who refused to be cornered, refused to be silent, and who taught millions watching a simple truth. A voice armed with facts is louder than robes, louder than rank, louder than intimidation. And so when history revisits this fictional showdown, the lesson will not be about hesitation. It will not be about seniority. It will be about courage crystallized into a line that still echoes across public consciousness.
Numbers don't lie.